Barron Trump disguises as a poor student. What his teacher does next will shock you. The school bell echoed through the long hallway as students rushed to their classrooms, their voices blending into a sea of laughter and conversation. It was a regular Monday morning at Willow Creek High, and for most, it was just another day. Teachers prepared their lessons, students gathered in groups, and life carried on as it always did. But today was different. Among the crowd of students, a quiet boy stood out, not because he wanted to, but because his tattered clothes and worn-out sneakers caught the attention of everyone who passed by. His shirt was frayed at the edges, with holes that revealed glimpses of pale skin beneath. His jeans were stained and torn, not in the fashionable way, but in the way that spoke of hardship and wear. His name was Barry, at least, that's what he told everyone. What no one knew, however, was that this porch student was actually Barron Trump, the son of one of the most powerful figures in the world. He had come to Willow Creek in disguise, determined to experience life as an ordinary student, to see what it was like to live without the privileges he had always known. Barry clutched the straps of his backpack tightly as he walked down the hallway, keeping his head low. He wasn't used to blending in like this. Back at home, every step he took was watched, every decision monitored. Here, no one knew who he really was. And for the first time in his life, he felt free. But freedom came at a price. "Hey, new kid," a loud voice called from behind him. Barry turned slowly, his eyes meeting those of a tall boy with a cocky grin. The boy was flanked by two others, their postures radiating confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing they ruled the school. Barry said nothing, his heart thudding in his chest. "Nice clothes," the tall boy sneered, his friends laughing on cue. "Where'd you get them? A dumpster?" Barry tightened his grip on his backpack, resisting the urge to respond. He had been warned about situations like this, about how kids could be cruel when they sensed weakness. But knowing it and experiencing it were two very different things. "Leave him alone," a voice cut through the tension. A girl with curly brown hair stepped between Barry and the bullies, her hands on her hips. "Seriously, Jake? You're still picking on new kids? Grow up." Jake scowled but backed off, muttering something under his breath before walking away with his friends. The girl turned to Barry, her eyes kind. "You okay?" Barry nodded, grateful but unsure how to respond. "Yeah? Thanks. I'm Emma," she said, offering a smile. "Don't mind them. They think they're cooler than they actually are." Barry smiled back, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. "I'm Barry. Nice to meet you, Barry. Come on, you don't want to be late for class." The classroom was buzzing with energy when Barry walked in, Emma by his side. He found a seat in the back, hoping to avoid drawing too much attention. The teacher, Ms. Robbins, stood at the front, organizing papers on her desk. She was known for being strict but fair, her sharp eyes missing nothing. As she glanced up, her gaze locked on Barry. Her brows furrowed slightly at the sight of his clothes, but she said nothing, continuing with her lesson. Barry listened intently, taking notes and doing his best to blend in. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Ms. Robbins was watching him more closely than the others. Every so often, he'd catch her glancing in his direction, her expression unreadable. After class, as the other students filed out, Ms. Robbins called out, "Barry, can I speak with you for a moment?" His stomach tightened, but he nodded and approached her desk. "How are you settling in?" she asked, her tone friendly but probing. "Fine," Barry replied, keeping his answers short. He knew better than to reveal too much. Ms. Robbins studied him for a moment before leaning forward slightly. "If you ever need anything at all, you can come to me, okay?" Barry nodded again, grateful for her kindness but wary of her attention. He left the classroom quickly, his heart pounding. He had come here to blend in, to see what life was like for ordinary kids. But it was already becoming clear that staying unnoticed might be harder than he thought. Over the next few days, Barry settled into a routine. He kept to himself, speaking only when spoken to and avoiding the bullies whenever possible. Emma became his closest friend, her warm personality a constant source of comfort in an otherwise unfamiliar world. For the first time, Barry experienced what it was like to have a life without bodyguards, without cameras following his every move. He even started to enjoy it. But not everyone was so welcoming. Ms. Robbins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the new student. There was something about the way he carried himself, something too poised, too polished for a boy who supposedly came from a difficult background. She had seen many struggling kids in her time, but Barry was different. He was quiet, almost too quiet, and his answers were always just a little too careful. One afternoon, she decided to dig deeper. After class, she asked Barry to stay behind again. "Barry," she said gently, "can I ask you something?" Barry tensed but nodded. "Where are you from?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I moved around a lot. My family's kind of private." Ms. Robbins raised an eyebrow. "I see. And your parents? What do they do?" Barry's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected this level of questioning. "They work in business." "Nothing exciting." Ms. Robbins leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "Well, if you ever need to talk, my door's always open." Barry forced a smile. "Thanks." As he walked out of the classroom, his heart raced. He knew he had to be more careful. Ms. Robbins was sharp, and if he wasn't careful, she might figure out who he really was. Barry's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he walked quickly toward the exit. His heart was still racing from Ms. Robbins's questioning, every word she had said playing back in his mind. He knew she was suspicious, and it wouldn't take much for her to connect the dots. He had to be more careful. One slip-up and everything would fall apart. Out in the schoolyard, Emma waved him over. She was sitting on a bench near the basketball court, her notebook open on her lap. "Hey, you okay? You look like you've just seen a ghost." Barry forced a smile and sat next to her. "I'm fine. Just long day." Emma tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You sure? You've been acting a little weird lately." "I'm good really," Barry insisted. He changed the subject quickly. "What are you working on?" Emma shrugged. "Math homework. It's brutal. You want to help?" Barry chuckled softly. "Sure." They spent the next 20 minutes solving equations together, and for a while, Barry felt like a normal kid again. No pressure, no secrets, just two friends trying to figure out high school math. But even in that peaceful moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that his time at Willow Creek was running out. Ms. Robbins wouldn't stop until she got answers, and the longer he stayed, the harder it would be to maintain the lie. The next morning, the tension was palpable the moment Barry stepped into class. Ms. Robbins greeted the students with her usual smile, but when her eyes landed on Barry, there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, maybe even suspicion. He avoided her gaze and took his seat, doing his best to appear calm. The lesson started as usual, but halfway through, Ms. Robbins paused and looked directly at Barry. "Barry, could you stay after class for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. Barry felt every eye on him, but he kept his face neutral. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. When the bell rang, the other students filed out, leaving him alone with Ms. Robbins. She waited until the door closed before speaking. "Barry," she said, folding her arms, "I've been thinking a lot about our conversations. You're a bright kid, but something doesn't add up." Barry's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression blank. "I'm not sure what you mean." Ms. Robbins leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "Your background, your story, it's all a little vague. And there's something about you that feels familiar." Barry said nothing, his mind racing. He couldn't admit the truth, but Ms. Robbins was too sharp to be fooled for long. He needed a way out and fast. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," Ms. Robbins continued, her voice softening. "But if you're in trouble or if there's something you're hiding, I can help." Barry hesitated. For a split second, he considered telling her everything. Who he really was, why he was here. But he quickly dismissed the thought. It was too risky. "I appreciate that," he said carefully. "But there's really nothing to tell?" Ms. Robbins studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right, but my offer still stands." Barry nodded and left the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He had dodged a bullet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before Ms. Robbins pushed further. Later that day, Barry sat in the cafeteria with Emma, picking at his lunch. He could still feel the weight of Ms. Robbins's questions pressing down on him, and it was starting to take its toll. Emma noticed his distraction and nudged him gently. "You've been quiet all day," she said. "What's going on?" Barry sighed, realizing there was no point in hiding it from her. "It's Ms. Robbins. She's asking a lot of questions about me." Emma frowned. "Like what?" "Like where I'm from, what my parents do, stuff like that." Emma leaned back, crossing her arms. "Well, you are a bit of a mystery. I mean, no one knows anything about you. Maybe she's just curious." "Maybe," Barry said. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Ms. Robbins wasn't just curious, she was digging for something. And if she found it, everything would fall apart. That evening, as Barry walked home, he replayed the day's events in his mind. He needed to come up with a plan, something that would keep Ms. Robbins from getting too close. But before he could figure it out, a voice called out behind him. "Hey, new kid." Barry turned to see Jake, the bully from before, leaning against a lamppost with a smug grin. Two of his friends stood behind him, their arms crossed. "You didn't think you could hide forever, did you?" Jake said, stepping closer. "Time for a little chat." Barry clenched his fists, his heart racing. He had dealt with bullies before, but Jake was relentless. The other students might have backed off after Emma intervened, but Jake seemed determined to make his life miserable. "You've been acting like you're better than us," Jake said, circling him like a predator. "But I think it's time we find out who you really are." Barry backed away, his pulse quickening. He knew Jake was just trying to provoke him, but his mind flashed to Ms. Robbins's questions. Was it possible that Jake had overheard something? Did he know more than he was letting on? Before Barry could respond, Jake lunged forward, grabbing the strap of his backpack. "Let's see what you're hiding in here." "Let go!" Barry shouted, struggling to break free. The scuffle drew the attention of passing students, their whispers growing louder as they watched. Barry fought to keep control of his bag, but Jake was stronger, and the strap finally gave way. The backpack hit the ground, spilling its contents across the pavement. For a moment, everything stopped. Jake bent down, picking up a small, leather-bound notebook. He opened it, his eyes widening as he scanned the pages. Slowly, he looked up at Barry, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, Jake said, holding up the notebook for everyone to see. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little secret." Barry's blood ran cold. He knew what was in that notebook. Details about his real identity, notes about his life as Barron Trump. He had been careful to keep it hidden, but now it was out in the open. The crowd murmured, their eyes flicking between Barry and Jake. Panic bubbled in Barry's chest. This was it. The secret was out. "Barron Trump?" Jake said, his voice dripping with mock disbelief. "No way. You expect us to believe that?" The crowd fell silent, every eye on Barry. His heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time, he had no idea what to say. The crowd seemed to freeze in place, every student's gaze locked on Barry as the weight of Jake's words hung in the air. For a split second, there was only silence, then a ripple of murmurs spread through the group, growing louder with each passing second. "Barron Trump," someone whispered. "Is that really him?" Barry clenched his jaw, his mind racing. His carefully constructed disguise, the weeks he had spent blending in, had just come crashing down around him. He glanced at Jake, who stood triumphantly, the notebook still clutched in his hand. "Give that back," Barry said, his voice calm but firm. Jake raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "Oh sure. But first, why don't you explain what this is all about? Hiding something, Barron?" The crowd pressed in closer, their curiosity piqued. Barry felt trapped, his pulse thudding in his ears. He could feel the walls closing in, the questions building like a tidal wave about to crash. "That's enough." A sharp voice cut through the chaos. Ms. Robbins appeared at the edge of the crowd, her eyes blazing with authority. She pushed her way through the gathered students, her heels clicking against the pavement with every determined step. When she reached the center of the circle, she fixed Jake with a withering glare. "Hand it over," she said, holding out her hand. Jake hesitated for a moment, his bravado faltering under Ms. Robbins's stern gaze. Finally, he handed her the notebook, his smug expression replaced with one of uncertainty. "Thank you," Ms. Robbins said coldly. She turned to Barry, her expression softening. "Come with me, Barry. Let's go somewhere private. Barry nodded numbly, grateful for the escape. He followed her through the crowd, the students parting to let them pass. The hallway felt impossibly long as they walked in silence, every step echoing off the walls. When they reached Ms. Robbins's office, she closed the door behind them and motioned for him to sit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ms. Robbins sat across from him, her hands folded on her desk, her eyes searching his face. "Is it true?" she finally asked, her voice gentle. "Are you Barron Trump?" Barry hesitated, his mind scrambling for an answer. But he knew there was no point in lying anymore. The truth was already out. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's true." Ms. Robbins nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I thought there was something different about you. You carried yourself differently. But I didn't expect this." Barry looked down at his hands, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to be normal for once. To see what life was like without cameras and security and constant attention." Ms. Robbins leaned back in her chair, her eyes filled with understanding. "That must be a lot to carry on your shoulders." "It is," Barry admitted. "That's why I came here. I thought if I could blend in even for a little while, I could feel free." Ms. Robbins was silent for a moment, then smiled softly. "Well, I can't imagine what that's like. But I do know that everyone deserves a chance to be seen for who they really are, not just their name or where they come from." Barry looked up, surprised by her kindness. He had expected her to be angry or disappointed, but instead, she seemed genuinely concerned for him. "You're not in trouble," Ms. Robbins continued. "But this situation is going to take some managing. We need to think carefully about how we handle it." Barry nodded. "I don't want anyone else to know. I just want to finish my time here quietly." Ms. Robbins thought for a moment, then said, "We'll do our best. I'll speak with the principal and make sure this stays as quiet as possible. But you should be prepared. Secrets like this have a way of spreading quickly." "Thank you," Barry said, his voice barely a whisper. Ms. Robbins smiled warmly. "You're welcome. And Barry, you're not alone in this. If you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open." Barry felt a surge of gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his own. The next few days were a whirlwind. The rumor about Barry's true identity spread faster than he had hoped, despite Ms. Robbins's efforts to contain it. Whispers followed him through the hallways, curious eyes watching his every move. Some students were awestruck, others skeptical, and a few, like Jake, were determined to make his life even harder. But something surprising happened too. Emma stuck by his side, her loyalty unwavering. "You're still the same person," she said when he tried to apologize for not telling her the truth. "I don't care who your family is. You're my friend, and that's all that matters." Her words meant more to him than she could have known. With Emma's support and Ms. Robbins's guidance, Barry found the strength to push through the challenges that came his way. Jake, however, wasn't done. Embarrassed that Ms. Robbins had called him out, he plotted one final stunt, a plan to humiliate Barry in front of the entire school. The school assembly was packed, the auditorium buzzing with energy. Barry sat near the back with Emma, trying to keep a low profile. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. As the principal addressed the crowd, Jake slipped onto the stage, a mischievous grin on his face. He grabbed the microphone and tapped it for attention. "Hey everyone," Jake said, his voice booming through the speakers. "I just wanted to introduce you to someone special. You might know him as Barry, but his real name is Barron Trump." Gasps filled the auditorium, and every head turned toward Barry. Barry's heart sank, but before he could react, Ms. Robbins stepped onto the stage, her eyes blazing with fury. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This assembly is not the place for personal attacks. Sit down, Dick." Jake froze, caught off guard. He opened his mouth to protest, but the principal shot him a look that silenced him immediately. Ms. Robbins turned to the crowd, her expression softening. "I think we've all learned an important lesson here today. It doesn't matter who someone is or where they come from. What matters is how we treat each other. Barry, or Barron, is a student just like the rest of you. He deserves the same respect and kindness you'd show anyone else. The auditorium fell silent. Slowly, the students began to nod, murmurs of agreement spreading through the crowd. Barry felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He met Ms. Robbins's eyes and gave her a small, grateful smile. Emma leaned over and whispered, "Looks like you've got more friends than you thought." Barry smiled back, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged. And maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The air in the auditorium hung heavy with anticipation. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. Barry could feel every eye on him, their stares a mix of curiosity, shock, and even admiration. His heart pounded, but a strange calm began to settle over him. It was out now, the truth no longer something he had to hide. Ms. Robbins remained on stage, her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet authority. "Respect and kindness are what make a real community," she continued, her voice steady but filled with warmth. "I know this is surprising for some of you, but Barron, or Barry as you know him, came here to experience life like any other student. He didn't ask for special treatment, and he didn't want it. So let's respect that." The murmur of voices softened, the initial shock giving way to something more thoughtful. Slowly, heads began to nod in agreement. The energy in the room shifted, and Barry could feel the weight of judgment lifting. Emma leaned over, her voice barely above a whisper. "Looks like you're not the only one who's learned something today." Barry gave a small smile. "Yeah, I guess not." The principal took the microphone, nodding toward Ms. Robbins with appreciation. "Thank you, Ms. Robbins. And thank you, students, for being the kind of community that welcomes everyone. Let's move on with today's assembly." The crowd settled, and Barry felt a warm rush of relief as the focus shifted back to the stage. Emma gave him a reassuring nudge. "See? No big deal." Barry chuckled softly. "Maybe not anymore." The rest of the day passed in a blur. To Barry's surprise, many of the students approached him with friendly curiosity, their questions far from judgmental. "Is it really true?" one asked. "Yeah," Barry said with a shrug. "But I'm still me." The student nodded thoughtfully. "That's pretty cool. I mean, you didn't have to come here like this." Barry smiled, realizing that maybe things wouldn't be as bad as he had feared. For every curious question, there were friendly words, offers to hang out, and even a few high fives. Jake and his crew stayed far away, their failed stunt clearly leaving them embarrassed. By the time the final bell rang, Barry felt lighter than he had in weeks. He walked toward the exit with Emma by his side, the sunlight streaming through the windows and warming his face. It felt like a fresh start, the kind of new beginning he had hoped for but never expected to find. "You survived," Emma teased as they stepped outside. "Not just survived," Barry said, glancing around at the familiar faces that now felt more like friends than strangers. "I think I might have found what I was looking for." Emma grinned. "I told you it wouldn't be so bad. You just needed a little push." Barry laughed, grateful for her steady presence. "I owe you, Emma. For everything." "Don't mention it," she said with a wink. "That's what friends are for." As they walked down the sidewalk, Barry glanced back at the school. It looked different now, less like a challenge and more like a place that had taught him something valuable. He had come here to be invisible, to escape the pressures of his real life. But instead, he had learned what it truly meant to be seen and accepted for who he was. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything else. The next morning, Barry arrived at school with a new sense of confidence. He walked through the hallway, his shoulders back and his head held high. A few students greeted him by name, his real name, and he smiled, returning their greetings without hesitation. Ms. Robbins met him at the classroom door, her eyes warm and proud. "Good morning, Barron," she said with a wink. "Ready for another day?" Barry grinned. "I think I can handle it." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "I have no doubt." The classroom was already buzzing with activity, the students chatting and laughing as they waited for the lesson to begin. Barry found his seat, feeling completely at ease for the first time since he'd arrived at Willow Creek. He caught Emma's eye, and she gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Ms. Robbins tapped her pen on the desk to get their attention. "All right, everyone, let's get started. We've got a lot to cover today." The class settled, and the lesson began. Barry opened his notebook, the same one Jake had tried to use against him, and smiled to himself. It felt like a symbol of everything he had learned, a reminder that the truth, no matter how complicated, always had a way of bringing people together. As the lesson continued, Barry felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had come here in search of something simple, something real. What he found was far more powerful than he ever could have imagined. True friendship, acceptance, and the strength to embrace who he was. No masks, no disguises. He glanced out the window, the sun shining brightly on the world beyond. This was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with unexpected challenges and even greater opportunities. And this time he was ready for all of it. Because now, for the first time in his life, he truly felt free.